Hi, Emily. It's August 2nd, 2019. And I don't know if you recall, but the last text exchange we had, we discussed a book that you were reading called Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And I had the idea that I might watch the movie and maybe check back with you and let you know what I thought about it. And indeed, I've done that. In fact, I'm here to report back on the movie, and I took some notes. Here are some notes that I wrote, handwritten notes on my iPad Pro, and I was going to go through them and talk to you a little bit about Wuthering Heights, the movie. Um, First, one thing I would like to mention is that I'm really impressed that you're reading Wuthering Heights as a 15-year-old. That's so wonderful. And I just embrace that virtue in you. And there are a few qualities that I notice when I contemplate the idea. Number one is your curiosity. It takes some curiosity to sort of wonder what this English literature is about, and particularly this particular genre of Gothic fiction. Um, there's a lot of depth in Gothic fiction. I think of other Gothic fiction books like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Those are other Gothic fiction works that we could read together, and I think that would be a lot of fun to go through. But I'm talking about your curiosity, and it's neat that you're curious about this genre and this book. And I'm wondering if part of the reason you've been intrigued by this book is your travels to England, perhaps. I think I remember you telling me that you went to Stonehenge. I think I might have seen a photograph of you nearby. And I'm guessing that you might have walked the moors, that moorland. That's just a fascinating place. I'm wondering if you went to a few places that inspired Emily Bronte to write the book Wuthering Heights. And, having that historical background on this story is amazing. And in fact, I think there's a society called the Bronte Society. And I'm a little curious if you're a member of the Bronte Society. I've been thinking about becoming a subscriber myself. So anyway, I really enjoyed this movie. And I haven't read the book. I know I've tried to read the book a few times, but anyway, I just wanted to mention that how much I admire your curiosity about the genre. Also, I appreciate any critical thinking skills that you're applying to this work. I know that you are a very intelligent young woman, and I'm just so pleased to see you thinking critically about literature and reading books during your summer. I appreciate this as a demonstration of your love of learning. There must be something about this book, something about the genre that you want to know about, that you're curious about, that you find fascinating. Maybe I'm not sure what themes in the book interest you, or whether it's the author. Could it be that Emily Bronte's name, Emily, intrigues you, and it's something that you'd like to discover more about her and her sisters? I think there were 4 Bronte sisters, and there are other books to read that are related, like Jane Eyre and other works. So anyway, I appreciate your love of learning. Another thing I appreciate is your perseverance. This is a challenging book to read through, and it's a fairly complicated story with what I call like a cyclic storyline. And, the names and the locations are varied, and I appreciate you rising to the intellectual challenge of reading a book like this. I also recognize that doing so requires a lot of self-regulation, a lot of self-control. And I appreciate that you've developed that habit. and those virtues over the years to develop this self control, this self discipline that you can, on your summer vacation, read a book as deep as this one is and enjoy it. Also, I appreciate this will to appreciate excellence. You know, I too am a lover of English literature, though I don't really indulge in it very often. In fact, one of my favorite movies is a movie called Educating Rita. And if you ever have a chance to watch that movie, it is very inspiring. It's all about this woman who is essentially uneducated in London, perhaps. And she goes to, and I'm guessing, Oxford to get a degree in English literature as a middle aged person. And she meets this professor and she learns English literature and is inspired by her professor and inspired by the works of art that she reads. Educating Rita, a great film, very inspiring. It's a film that I use personally as a form of intrinsic motivation to get me to enjoy more and more English literature. Um, I also appreciate in you, Emily, the will to appreciate beauty and artistic expression. Uh, while I was watching the movie, I appreciated just the beauty of the language that Emily Bronte used. I appreciate the imagery and the metaphor. I also appreciated some of the really challenging subjects that Emily Bronte raised. And, it's really beautiful. This work that she sort of handed down to us from her mind is beautiful. And it is just an amazing piece of artistic expression. And I really appreciate in you, Emily, your willingness to recognize the beauty of this work of art and indulge in it and love it. And so, with that, let's go on to the movie. And so, let me tell you first off, one of the highlights of the movie for me that I really enjoyed was the music. The music is fabulous. The score is so dramatic. Um, I really love the string instruments and the, sort of like the moody nature of the music. It really, I think, captured the story. And I love the high strings along with some of the really deep bass notes in the soundtrack. Love the music to this movie. By the way, I'm watching the 1964 version of um, Wuthering Heights, and it's in color. And by the way, the production value of this movie is very high. I really enjoyed the actors and actresses. The child actors were also quite good. And I just felt that it had a really high level of quality. Even the special effects, I think, were very well done for the time. I love the sets. I thought that they were very detailed. And I love sort of the recreation of the homes, these homesteads, these farmhouses, and the sets and how they pulled that all together. As yeah, just what's going on? Uh, oh, looks like I got a text message from whom I don't know who. Oh, okay, all right. So let's see. Um, okay, I'm gonna have to turn off my phone. uh, okay, so um, oh yeah, okay. So oh yeah, I wanted to mention that the actor that I especially appreciated was Janek McTeer. Um, for me, her role as Ellen, um, uh, actually Nellie, they nickname her Nellie in the film, but Ellen is her name. I really appreciated Nellie or Ellen Dean as sort of like she's the housekeeper that roams between the two homes, and I don't know. I loved her as like as the storyteller. She was relating the story to Lockwood during his convalescence when he got ill, and he was hanging out at um, Thrush Thrush Cross, Thrush Cross Grange, and um, I really appreciate in the movie. She's played by this amazing actress, Janet McTeer, who's just strikingly beautiful, and also has this evenness, this even emotional tone that really contrasts the Catherine and Heathcliff. Anyway, oh, Heathcliff, by the way, played by Ralph Fiennes. Wow, what an actor! And what he did such a good job. He had such what I'd call a brooding, a very good brooding stare that he would use frequently throughout the movie as an actor. And I really enjoyed just sort of watching him in his dark, brooding mood. And he played Heathcliff very well. Heathcliff, by the way, as a character, is an animal. He's an animal and thoroughly unlikable character. I must. He is definitely not a protagonist. He is definitely the antagonist of the film, and just a certainly a key character, but one who I would not like to know this person in real life. That's for sure. A few themes of the movie that were interesting to me were uh, the usefulness of having a house and land. You know, how having a house was a sense of power. I think about the Heights and the Grange. That is the Wuthering Heights homestead and the Thrush Cross Grange homestead, the Heights and the Grange. Those two homesteads, um, it was interesting how they essentially represented power and in the story, and how um, there were various elements of our culture, of our society, where um, these powers were sort of traded among people through marriage, acquisition through um, also what is it called, inheritance. When the father dies, the children get the manor, right? They get the house. And it's interesting how these houses just became like these sources of power. And that Heathcliff sort of wielded his intelligence to sort of, uh, grab the Wuthering Heights manor and also the Grange manor. And he did both of them. So here's the thing about Heathcliff: super smart guy, but also um, obsessive. Definitely obsessive in his love for Catherine, and dark, and his mood all the time is just so resenting and angry, and it was palpable certainly through the movie, um, and I can imagine through the book, his resentment and anger was palpable. But of course, so was his love. His love for Catherine. um, Another point that I got through the movie, another theme that I saw through the movie, was how marriage was a big part of the acquisition of property, and marriage itself was sort of a source of power, and how marriage really was sort of, I don't know, that the purpose of marriage wasn't necessarily love as we know it today, but the purpose of marriage was sort of really a way to wield power, a way to transfer value, to transfer money, to transfer property. And it was kind of interesting to watch that dynamic, how people were making decisions about who they wanted to marry based on sort of economics. In fact, it was Catherine who decided partly to not marry Heathcliff and marry Edgar Linton instead, because, well, Edgar Linton had this amazing home, Thrush Cross Grange. And even though her love was for Heathcliff, her undying love was for Heathcliff. So, what an interesting choice Catherine made, and really sort of set up this whole story. I have a sense that this story couldn't necessarily have taken place in the modern day because, well, divorce is so common in the modern day. Back in 1850 um, or earlier, I have a feeling that, well, marriage was like a vow between two people, and it was kept sacred, and it was sort of an unbreakable bond. And so because of that, people like Heathcliff and Catherine, who loved each other deeply, um, wouldn't be able to connect because they were married to other people, right? Catherine was married to Edgar, and Heathcliff was married to Isabel. There was no way for them to connect. They had made their choices. Catherine marrying Edgar for money, basically, and Heathcliff marrying Isabel for revenge, to get revenge against Catherine, who he loved. But today that wouldn't work out because if they wanted to be together, all they would have to do is get a divorce, and then they could be together. In fact, that's an interesting aspect of the story that sort of comes that I thought was interesting, and that was how this whole poverty, this whole idea of scarcity. What was the reason, the ultimate reason that Catherine married Edgar? Well, it was the security and the wealth that he offered. And, it was a natural choice, even though Catherine's heart was for Heathcliff. Catherine married Edgar. It was light, it was easy. She even mentioned her love for Edgar as being like enjoying this plants of the season, like the trees of the season, how the leaves would fall in the winter, and but now was the spring and the summer, and she was easily sort of guided that way. I think partly for for wealth, and not only that, the prestige of being in the high class of landed gentry that that Edgar Linton had. And I think Catherine even mentioned that she would be just this high lady of the neighborhood if Catherine married Edgar. And it's true. It was really a question about class. The reasons she had for marrying Edgar had to do with class, had to do with money, and that wouldn't necessarily have been the case if resources weren't scarce. If every character in the story was wealthy, then there wouldn't even be a question, right? Heathcliff and Catherine would have gotten married for sure. But there were other factors that came into play. I don't know how easy it is to live on moorland. The moor certainly is beautiful and it's gorgeous, but the landscape is rather stark. And I'm not sure if there's like a lot of game or a lot of resources like fuel and water to be had on the moor. I'm guessing that there isn't a lot of resources. And my feeling is that, this landed gentry got their money because they were basically renting out their homes to passersby or wealthy travelers. And that's how they became wealthy, and not necessarily because of all the resources on the land. And, what's kind of interesting is that this role scarcity plays, in the story. It's really pivotal. The role marriage plays in the story is also quite pivotal. And I don't know, interesting stuff. There is another theme that sort of was a string that I noticed through the story. It had to do with unrequited love. Now, unrequited love means love that's not shared by another, love that's not returned. And really, the story revolves around unrequited love, where, Catherine did not sort of reflect back the love to Heathcliff because she wanted to marry Edgar Linton. And then Heathcliff loved Catherine, but became angry with her after she made a choice he didn't like, and withdrew his affection from Catherine. In fact, it's kind of interesting, this whole dynamic where you've got these two characters, they both love and hate each other. So they're both loving each other and cursing each other. It's a really odd kind of love where, you know, they both are obsessed with each other and they both hate each other for rejecting one another. And they also love each other more than anything. This is obsessive love, an obsessive love that is so strong that it sort of transcends even their own deaths, right? So Catherine dies and she comes back as a ghost, and she scares Lockwood when he shows up at Wuthering Heights, and even in the end, I got the sense, at least from the movie, that and I'm talking about the very, very end, when Heathcliff basically goes crazy because Catherine's not around, and because she's dead, that he sort of starves himself, right? He doesn't eat for 3 or 4 days, and then he's found dead. Um, so yeah, and then what I mean by that is that he, basically he dies, and so he goes to live with Catherine in the afterlife, right? So there's this whole sense about the afterlife and ghosts and love that transcends life and moves beyond death. It's really tragic how obsessive Heathcliff's love was, and Catherine's love, and how Catherine was really obsessive too about Heathcliff's love. I don't know if you recall, but in the story, Catherine plays herself as being very, very ill twice. Once when she was pregnant, and then another time she played ill when she lost Heathcliff. That's when Catherine mentioned when she was speaking with Nellie that she couldn't love Heathcliff because it would be beneath her because of his lack of education and lack of social class. And Heathcliff overheard that and ran away. And then, Catherine sort of drove herself crazy. So yeah, Catherine's love was just as obsessive and destructive as Heathcliff. In fact, they both sort of drove themselves and drove each other to their own deaths. In fact, in a way, it's very Shakespearean, Romeo and Juliet, where both those characters, the lovers, the star-crossed lovers, commit suicide for each other. This is very much the same. Heathcliff and Catherine essentially commit suicide, and they do it on account of their destructive, obsessive love. Heathcliff doesn't eat for 3 or 4 days and is found dead, and the same is true for Catherine. Catherine, because of her loss of Heathcliff, basically, certainly after the baby, essentially dies from a broken heart. They each make themselves crazy. It's interesting how this story treats mental illness. It's almost like a choicefulness. How mental illness is portrayed in the book is like, they just chose to become mentally ill, which there's a different understanding these days. What I enjoyed about in the movie was these themes of like the enduring emotions of youth. There was a lot of sentimentalism and reminiscence and nostalgia in both Catherine and Heathcliff. They were continuously obsessing over each other because of their history. They grew up together as brother and sister and in the same household, and the Earnshaw household. And they learn to love each other as children, and it really actually is quite poignant. Emily Bronte here is talking about how when people are young, like teenagers, like you are, Emily, how like at age 15, 16, 17, the emotions are so strong and powerful. And how these crushes, these childhood crushes, have a tendency to be retained. And in fact, this actually the same is true for me. I mean, I still have crushes on girls that I had when I had those crushes when I was in high school. So, these feelings are so strong and they get etched into our minds, and this is true for everyone. Um, and it's just an interesting fact about the brain in our teenage years, and how those passions could be really powerful. In fact, I think that for me, at least, when it comes to feelings of love, I think they were certainly at my height in my teenage years. I was, they're just so powerful. They get slightly diminished over time, but not much. They still are a big part of uh, people's emotional lives and adults' emotional lives too as we grow older. But they are especially strong when you're a teenager. One other theme I noticed was that this is a very tragic story. Lots of tragedy, lots of darkness. We've got the mutual suicide of the main characters. Um, we've got Heathcliff, who is basically an animal. He's essentially a beast of a man, where he mistreats his children. He mistreats the children he's acquired. He is mistreated by Hindley. Um, Everyone mistreats everyone else. uh, it's really really sad how, for example, Heathcliff certainly mistreats Kathy, Kathy Linton, when he makes Kathy and his son Linton Heathcliff get married. I mean, golly, that was in the latter part of the book. But basically, Heathcliff locks her into his house, locks him, and as a captive, he makes them marry each other. So strange, but just really tragic, tragic. This controlling nature of Heathcliff and his dominant nature is just really, uh, really a problem. Um, you know, I did want to mention again just how much I enjoyed Ellen Dean as what I call like a central figure in the film. You know, Nellie, or Ellen Dean, she really spins the story here. She's the storyteller. She's essentially the narrator, and she relays all this information. She is present during pretty much the whole story, the major parts of the story, both at Wuthering Heights and at Thrushcross Manor or Grange. And I really appreciate Ellen Dean as essentially really the central character, sort of the nexus of everything that's going on. I also, believe it or not, I appreciated the happy ending of this movie. I think there is a happy ending. Um, when when is it? Yeah, when Kathy Linton and um, Hare, Hare. I'm losing his name. Heron, If. Um, I just lost the name for just a microsecond. I'll get to it. It's Heron. Anyway, when they get married, actually, I don't think they're planning to get married on the 4th of July, and this is a very generational tale where you've got a few generations working. Emily Bronte talks about, well, 12 years passes, and 3 years pass, and there's a lot of time that passes, and it's really, there's like this first generation, and then there's the second generation. The first generation are the Earnshaws and the Lintons, the older gentlemen, and then they've got the children, which is where Heathcliff and Catherine fit in. And then there's another subsequent generation where their children start um, sort of getting together and befriending one another and making enemies of one another. We're talking about the Kathy Linton and the Heron Harish. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting a critical name of a character. But and of course, the son. What's the son's name? Well, I'll get to it later. But yeah, it's the intergenerational nature of this movie, and how in the end it's really a happy ending, because basically the main characters are all dead. They're in their graves, and the younger folks, they basically get the inheritance of the homes that have been acquired by Heathcliff. And they're living a life that's just completely footloose and fancy free. Yeah. So let's see, what other themes that I appreciate through this story. Okay. Well, first of all, social class. Social class was really a main subject area in this movie. Really that was a big part of the reason that Catherine couldn't marry Heathcliff. It was because Heathcliff was just not of the same social class, mainly because Hindley sort of forced Heathcliff down into the social class. After Hindley received, when he went to college and then he came back, he was educated, he was the head of household there at Wuthering Heights. And, he basically demoted his own brother, Heathcliff, to the stables, right? And then he also did not support Heathcliff in learning how to read or becoming educated himself. And so, manners, he didn't necessarily teach, Hindley did not necessarily teach Heathcliff any manners. And so Heathcliff basically fell out of the social caste system. He was the lowest of the low. And really, it wasn't until he left that Heathcliff built for himself. I don't know if you recall, but Heathcliff ran away when he heard Catherine say that there's no way that Catherine could marry him because he's so low and uneducated. When he ran away, he left for 3 years, somehow made his fortune. I'm not sure. Maybe he came into an inheritance of some kind. I'm not sure. But he comes back 3 years later, and Heathcliff is now this gentleman, and apparently he got money. I don't know how he got money. That's actually a big question for me. I wish Emily Bronte would have sort of explored that part a little bit more about how Heathcliff got his money. Other things. So that's social class. Let's see. Yeah. What I also think is interesting is Hindley sort of demoted his brother Heathcliff to a lower social class. Remember, he sent Heathcliff to the stables. I'm guessing against his father's will. Now, of course, his father was dead, Mr. Earnshaw. He died. He was not able to support Heathcliff. But I think that Mr. Earnshaw would have wanted Heathcliff to get along with Hindley and Catherine, all at the same social class. And it really is actually quite unfortunate that Hindley took the stance he took and sort of forced Heathcliff down to a lower social class. I think that happened against the wishes of his father, Mr. Earnshaw. And really that is, I think, one of the main triggers of some of this tragedy. Let's see. Gender inequality is a big theme throughout the movie. What's interesting about that is that the men and the women each had certain roles to play out. And it was really fascinating how like Heathcliff used his physical power, his masculine powers, and of the male gender, and how women sort of respected that, the use of that power, and maybe they were defenseless in the face of his physical prowess. I don't know, um, but there is this really whole thing about gender inequality, about the roles of the genteel gentleman compared to the genteel woman. And it was interesting to see how that all played out in 19th century England. Um, Also, violence. Violence was a huge theme in this film. There was just some. What's kind of interesting was there was not a lot of physical violence, other than what I'd call, there was some. Well, actually, there was violence. There was what I'd call spousal abuse. Certainly, when Heathcliff sort of basically began torturing Isabel, his wife, and there was child abuse. Certainly, Hindley basically casting Heathcliff down to the stables and basically treating him very poorly. Heathcliff, of course, did the same thing. Um, Heathcliff treated Hareton very poorly. I think Heathcliff probably might also have treated Linton Heathcliff poorly. Um, yeah, and of course, more violence. There's a lot of interpersonal violence in the sense like, well, certainly there was suicide. That's self violence, and I think there was also a fist fight between Heathcliff and Edgar Linton when he came to the house, and then Edgar Linton banished Heathcliff from his house. So, yeah, the theme of violence, I think, is really strong throughout this book. And it's kind of interesting. There is no, uh, you know, I sort of recognize this book as being sort of written during the Victorian age to some extent. And, people at the time, back in the early 1800s and the late 1700s, they were quite religious, very proper. And so it's no surprise to me that Emily Bronte published this book under a pseudonym. Another, yeah, I mentioned mental illness played a big role in this movie. Hey Google, turn off the alarm, please. Yeah, mental illness played a big role in this movie. Basically both of the main characters were mentally ill. There was a lot of pessimism also and resentment. I think that's also a major theme. Essentially, Heathcliff couldn't forgive Catherine for rejecting him. And he basically kept that resentment for years and basically his whole life. And he really did some dastardly things. I mean, like I mentioned, he was definitely an animal. Um, One thing that was interesting to me, as an interesting theme, is that um, at least for Heathcliff, well, you know, I wrote here that relationships matter more than money. Um, Heathcliff did eventually gain ownership of both the Heights and the Grange, those two homes, but he still was a tortured person. I don't think Heathcliff really appreciated his wealth. He didn't enjoy it. I don't think his wealth made him any happier, except for the fact that that it helped him get revenge over the people he didn't like. It helped him get revenge over Catherine, helped him get revenge over Edgar. Um, Definitely, I guess a theme throughout this story is that money is incidental, and really it's relationships which are key. And I actually I kind of resonate with that. I do think that relationships and connection are more important than money. So, that's kind of interesting that I would find some kind of alignment in the themes of this story, but only when it comes to how important relationships are. Um, the rest of the story was just so dark. I personally have a hard time relating to it. Um, One aspect of the story I think is true is that I think that Edgar Linton is a hero. He took care of Catherine after she got bit by the dog. Uh, Edgar Linton asked for Catherine's hand in marriage. I don't think that's something that Heathcliff ever did. Um, Edgar took care of Catherine, even though Catherine feigned mental illness 2 times. Um, you know, Edgar was always a gentleman. I think Edgar is really an unsung hero of the book. Oh, there was also another part of the book I thought that was interesting, and just what kind of a role cursing took place. Now, Emily, you may not be sensitive to this very much because of your youth, your Gen Z, but back then, just a few 20, 50, 30, 20, 50, 100 years ago, there were a lot of people in the world who were very religious, and casting spells or making prayers or making proclamations or making predictions about the future as a kind of prophecy. These are all like spiritual acts. And throughout this movie, both Heathcliff and Catherine were basically cursing each other, which is essentially heretical. It's essentially hypocritical. Hypocrisy is the word that I'm getting to. Hypocrisy means, acting against the church or acting against the Bible. And there was a lot of it in this, in this story. You may not be have a sensitive ear enough to pick up on it, but it's this idea that words are powerful and magical, and that spells, basically like the marriage vow is kind of like a spell that means you sort of are linked to another person forever. But there are a lot of other examples where Heathcliff was like doing prophecies and making curses, even cursing Catherine to torment in hell eternally. That kind of stuff, those kind of statements would have been very offensive to a very religious audience. Today, it's almost incidental, and I don't think people even pay attention to it. But there is like this religious hypocrisy theme moving through the book, which is interesting. Now, I did have a few questions about the book. Like, for example, I want to know how Heathcliff became a wealthy gentleman in 3 years. That's a pretty amazing transformation for anyone. And I guess he maybe came into his inheritance of some kind. I don't know how. The only reason I mentioned that came into his inheritance phrase was because I noticed that was in the movie. Edgar Linton suggested that as a possibility as to how Heathcliff got so much wealth when he came back 3 years later. I would like to know, oh yeah. So here's one of the facts that I've noticed, or things that I've noticed about Wuthering Heights, is that, and this might only be true in the United States, and it might only be true around the people that I am familiar with, but I get a real definite sense that this book, and particularly even Emily Bronte, but particularly this book, Wuthering Heights, seems to be loved and beloved by women in particular, as opposed to men. Now, I'm not really sure why that is. I have a feeling that this book touches on a lot of subject areas that are important to women, mainly things about having to do with like spousal abuse, certainly. Also, things having to do with obsessive love and being desired, and how important that is, and how it can be intoxicating, I think, to some women. I think there's another aspect that women are interested in, and that is how this book explores ideas related to, say, choosing wealth over true love. Now, today that doesn't happen as much. It probably happened a lot 150 years ago because of the scarcity of resources. But of course, today everybody's like a millionaire compared to how people lived 150 years ago. So women make different choices today, that's for certain. But I think there still is this certain idea, at least, about women in particular making marriage decisions based on wealth instead of love. And I'm still noticing that that's showing up in the popular culture a lot, even though it's not necessarily, I mean, there's so much wealth here in the United States um, that wouldn't necessarily be a factor, but I think for some it is. But that's interesting how this book explores what I'd call largely female topics of interest. This question about class and status, I think that is also has an interest to a women audience, and here's the reason why. I think it has mainly to do with the fact that women have children, and women have a very strong interest in making sure that those children are raised in a way that's healthy and happy, and being well off financially is a big part of that. That the children get educated, and I think that women definitely look to men having resources to support that project. And the fact that this book sort of treats that in some respect, I think, is part of the draw of the book to a female audience. Um, okay. I have a few other questions. Like, Heathcliff has no last name. Everybody has a last name, like Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Linton. Everybody's got a last name, but Heathcliff. And that may be because he was essentially an orphan living on the streets in Liverpool when Mr. Earnshaw picked him up. And I guess Mr. Earnshaw just named him Heathcliff and didn't feel it necessary to give him a last name. I think, that even that little bit might have helped Heathcliff sort of be more accepted in his class if he would have had a last name. So I still am a little bit curious, Emily, about why you might have chosen this book, Wuthering Heights, to focus on. I'm kind of curious if when you visited England, you had the opportunity to visit the moors and maybe visit, say, a historical museum or a museum of literature and art, and come upon this Emily, who's this famous writer. I wonder if, in your visits to England, whether that was inspiring you to read a book like this. Um, and let's see, what other things? Oh, yeah. One thing I noticed is this issue of isolation. This is a story about two families in two houses out on the moors, basically in isolation from the rest of regular society. And, these children are falling in love with each other, like Catherine and Heathcliff, because, well, there's nobody else to fall in love with because nobody else is around. I mean, I got that sense that and um, Hareton and Kathy fall in love because there's just no one else around. Because here's the question I had. The main question is, why would Hareton and Kathy fall in love, particularly when Heathcliff essentially forced Kathy to marry Linton, who later died, because he wanted to acquire their the Thrush Cross Grange. And why would Kathy ever fall in love with Hareton? Hareton basically didn't comfort Kathy when she was imprisoned in the home. And in fact, I think even kept her in prison. So why would Kathy ever fall in love with Hareton? I don't know. my guess is that there's just no one else around to fall in love with. There was just no other men. And so this question of isolation, this problem of isolation, I think sort of enters into the story somehow. If these people lived in the big, like, New York City metropolis or in Los Angeles megalopolis, I have a feeling that they wouldn't necessarily fall in love like they did. They just didn't have any options. And you know, I think it's fascinating how isolation. I think that isolation might have even created some of this obsessive thinking on the part of both Catherine and Heathcliff. I mean, if Catherine and Heathcliff lived in a big city and they had lots of dating opportunities and they had dating apps like OK Cupid or Match or whatever, um, I don't think that they would get as obsessed as they were about each other. So I think isolation has a big role in making this story believable. Um, yeah, and I wonder too about how do people live on a moor? It's so desolate, so isolating. There really can't be a lot of resources out there, and I don't know. So Emily, I've sort of come to the end of our analysis, or of my analysis, and you know, I really, really enjoyed this movie, and I'm actually thinking about possibly reading the book too, or at least maybe listening to the audiobook of Wuthering Heights. And I would love to get more feedback from you about how you're enjoying the story. And I would love to do a deep dive into other Gothic fiction works. Like I talked about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula. I've actually kind of read Bram Stoker's Dracula and I love the book. It was just so wonderful. I love this Gothic fiction genre. And in fact, believe it or not, I think even writers like Edgar Allan Poe with their poetry, I mean, I still reference The Raven. You might remember when you were growing up that I had a particular affinity for ravens, and I think I shared that my love for ravens with you. And I think partly that love comes from knowing biologically how intelligent they are, but also my reading of Edgar Allan Poe and his poem The Raven. And so reading more Edgar Allan Poe poems and reading more about Dracula and Frankenstein and other Gothic fiction. Anything by Charles Dickens certainly would be amazing. And I'd love to read Charles Dickens with you as Christmas comes along here at the end of this year. And we could just go on we could read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol together and even go see the show, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol at the American Melodrama Theater, like in November and December. And I love this foray into Gothic fiction. And I just wanted to say thank you for bringing the subject to my attention, letting me know what you're interested in. And, it's really, I really appreciate it, Em. And I really loved going through this movie. And it has become a favorite movie of mine. I recognize this story in English literature as being important and significant. I recognize its excellence and its quality. And I really foresee a time when we may together read similar books like this in the future. So with that, I want to end by saying that I love you, I cherish you, and that I'm looking forward to other things we get to do together. And I want you to know that I think you are a wonderful daughter. I think that you are a great daughter. And I'll end with that. Have a wonderful rest of the day, Emily. Bye-bye. I love you.